Welcome to Accessibility Now, the podcast from the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. I'm your host, Matt Shedd. On this episode, we speak with Tiffany Clifford, a longtime leader in Georgia's independent living movement. Tiffany reflects on how she first got involved in disability advocacy, her early days with Walton Options, and the foundational role that the SILCGA has played in expanding services around the state. She also shares her concerns about looming federal budget cuts and what they could mean for the future of independent living. Here's Tiffany.
So can you tell me about when you first got involved, I guess, with the independent living movement generally, and then your experience of SILC and your early interactions with it?
Well, I had initially been introduced to independent living, but not really an understanding when I was working in Jacksonville, Florida, with adults who had deaf blindness. And we had a center in Jacksonville that we coordinated services with, community kind of activities, but I didn't really understand what the organization fully was. Back then, I was very early in my career coming out of the education system and just kind of learning about things. But what I did know is that I was working for an organization that very much believed in consumer engagement, consumer control, having, despite the level of disability, which these were profoundly disabled individuals who had been, actually they were children born when their mom had rubella, so that was what resulted in the deaf blindness and the developmental disabilities that they had. But even then, my director strongly believed and taught and instilled in me to see how important it was that every person have a right to their own dignity and quality of life and control over that. So the philosophy really aligned pretty similarly as I got to know more about independent living, and that wasn't until 1999 when I came to Georgia and became employed with Walton Options. And so the full integration to understanding independent living and also the SILC kind of came simultaneously. So when I started going on 26 years ago, the organization I was working for, Walton Options, had been in existence for 5 years. And we had a small independent living network in Georgia that Pat Puckett, who was director of the SILCGA at the time, was working very hard to develop and strategize both with state funding, federal funding, and the growth in the communities, having these small community-based grassroots group to build up independent living centers in the state.
I gotcha. And so what was that like in the early days, the relationship between Walton Options and the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia? Was there quite a bit of communication and support provided, or has that kind of evolved over the years?
I think that from the time that I entered, the very first SILC meeting I had was very soon after I started as the executive director at Walton Options. And, if you go back in time and people thinking over their lives, there's certain moments, I guess, that when you're working, for me, I guess I can't speak for everybody, for me, there's certain moments in my field of work and experiences that I can still very clearly remember the placement of that, many of the people that were present. And that first SILC meeting was one of them because, like I said, that was kind of my stepping in. I was just stepping into my role. I wasn't really clear, honestly, as the executive of this organization, what all that really entailed. And so I feel like the SILC was always very, I'm trying to think of the best. There's several words, kind of approachable, supportive. Pat definitely had a drive to build, like I said, independent living and the centers in Georgia and make sure that we had the supports and the resources to help Georgians across all places of Georgia to have access to live a life of quality, independent, in charge of their life in the community, not in institutions, have employment, not just be relegated to workshops and in places that, stored people with disabilities. So I think the relationships were always strong. I believe strongly myself that the reason we have a network today is because of that, a lot of that early work of the SILC in Georgia. I've always been of the opinion that Georgia has one of the strongest SILCs in the country. For the most part, it's always been a strong partnership amongst the centers, along with the SILC, working together to achieve mutual goals that benefit all across our state. I think one of the biggest hindrances that we had for a long time was really there was like, when I first came on, I saw such a strong momentum, and then we kind of got into this lull that was relative to state fundings and politics and things like that, where, centers were being developed, and then we had like this long lapse of time where we didn't have services in certain counties, which was always, I think, kind of like that thorn for most of us, is that we want to see full statewide coverage. And so we had strong momentum and support kind of happening in early days with federal funding that was starting to come in and be available, and some state interest. But then it kind of hit a barrier. And so for a long time, we sat with counties that had no services at all. We finally, in the last year, through collaboration with GVRA and the state budget, have been able to at least cover all counties with information referral, which is a good start, because at least it gets people into independent living and understanding more about what's available and how to advocate for the resources that are needed.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's been one of the big accomplishments that I've been really impressed with since starting to work with the SILCGA is seeing that statewide coverage being put into place, and as a great starting point to, like you said, expanding those services beyond information referral. Yeah, that's been a really fun thing to watch happen. And a lot of credit goes to Shelley for all of her work and making sure that happens, and the rest of the staff, of course. Could you kind of elaborate on how the SILC supported the expansion of the SIL network throughout the state, and how you kind of watch that process unfold over the years?
Yeah. So as I alluded to, Pat was the first director of SILC. And when I came in to the services, one of the first things I found out was that the SILC had contracts with all the individual centers to provide independent living services. So one of the things for her was that she always wanted to put as much financial resources back to the centers to be able to do the work as possible. So the SILC actually took the money that was allocated to them and then contracted with the individual centers to deliver additional IL services, especially the home modifications, because that was a strongly identified need for people in Georgia. And again, we're talking, 26 years ago for myself, and I think the SILC was going on 5 years at that point. So this is 30 years ago, and we're still talking about some of the same barriers, but I think we've made progress. So investing financially was a strong part of that, and even identifying other grant resources to help support as well. And Pat was really good about being engaged with a lot of coalitions. She did not really, if she had any, let fear or barriers that were identified stand her way. She's always been a very blunt, straightforward spoken person. And sometimes I think, people might have been offended by that, but sometimes people need to be offended by it because, the ultimate thing was that people with disabilities were going without services or opportunities while able-bodied people had, those privileges. So sometimes people have to have things put in their face for them to really recognize, what's wrong with our systems. So she worked with groups in different communities to help develop, like I said, those grassroots organizations to build in communities that could then apply for the federal funding and the assistance provided with that. So I can remember in those meetings, like I said, that very first one stands out so strongly to me, being in a room with what I consider a lot of the goats of Georgia as far as advocacy and independent living. Anil Lewis, Mark Johnson, of course, Pat, Geraldine Leverett, Virginia Harris, James Aberson, Rocky, I think his name was Rocky Rothrock. And at the time, 2 or 3 major campaigns that were being kicked off again, kind of coming out of these conversations and leadership with Silk being part of the generator of that, like unlock the waiting list, working with Beth and getting waiting lists for people to have personal attendance services now. So it wasn't just building the independent living centers, but also expanding the capacity of resources in the state that we now coordinate with in order to provide our services in our communities. So unlock the waiting list. Mark Johnson was working on the 10-year anniversary of the ADA and doing a engagement with a larger span across the country with the torch run because it was flowing shortly after the Olympics, had been in Georgia. Anil Lewis with the National Federation of the Blind and those programs. So getting all these people at the table in those meetings. And something else about our Silk that I always thought was very unique is that many times those meetings, and they continue today, to bring these partners to the table to share state and or national resources with the centers to build our capacity to implement things and to expand, with how that works. So it wasn't just sitting around the table talking Silk Council business, but they were actually learning session, many conferences to build capacity and work together amongst ourselves in these coalitions, the state agencies, what have you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and gives some really good context to the process of building things out. And could you, just for people that might not be familiar with it, could you kind of describe what the process of starting a center for independent living looks like?
Well, it may look different these days, because there's several things that have happened over time in the federal level that's created some boosts for a lot of centers to come on board.
Well, you could just describe it in your.
Yeah. So generally, and that was also something I felt like was kind of unique for Georgia that we had to back up and regroup, was that you have usually a grassroots group of people who have an interest. The funding is identified for it. And in this group, they identify the area of coverage and what the work plan looks like, the board, and they begin the nonprofit status creation as well. And so when you actually apply for the federal award, it's a full process where you present, your service area, what are the tasks that you're going to have, your work plan, what your capacity is, what your demographics look like, and then of course, your case for support. One of the things, again, that I felt like was very unique in Georgia when I came in, we were just wrapping up the end of it, is that Pat was working with centers to mentor areas for new centers. So as an example, Walton Options was mentoring Macon. And part of that was because back in those days, if you applied for the federal awards and you didn't get it, they would redisperse funding to the other states. So you would lose that opportunity. So the vision was to help make sure that centers that were applying had a strong, stable Part C center that was already receiving federal dollars directly to help mentor that other center, receive the funds, help pay for the services to assure that they had the foundational pieces to help them be successful. A lot of organizations start and you do this grant process if you don't already have an established organization that's building and functioning as a business, but you haven't put in like the accounting piece or the director piece or some of these other positions that help manage the business side of it. Because while we're a service organization, nonprofits, there's also still a business side of us that we have to comply with. I've always said it's less likely to get in trouble with our grant entity than it is with some of these other businesses where you have to comply like the IRS and Department of Labor and these organizations because they're managing that side of it. So Walton Options mentored Macon, and then once we had Part C established like in Atlanta, Augusta, Savannah, and Macon, each of us then began to mentor another area down in Bainbridge, up in Rome, over in Athens. So pockets of people who had the drive and the desire to create independent living centers in their communities were part of that. And then the centers helped mentor for them to become their own independent living center independently, that helped prepare them for the process of actually writing that grant to the federal agency at the time, which was RSA, Rehab Services Administration, so that there was more likelihood of success in receiving it.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
No.
Okay. And here I'm kind of asking you to repeat yourself a little bit, but maybe just kind of for people that are new to this, if you could give like a 10,000-foot view of what the relationship is between SILCs and the Centers for Independent Living, just generally speaking.
So I probably need to start with some misinformation or misunderstandings and to elaborate it.
Oh,
Lots of people see the SILC as like the standing authority over the centers. That's not accurate. We are separate entities. Every center is a separate entity, a separate nonprofit that reports to its own board of directors. The same thing for the SILC. The SILC is a separate entity. Many of them, like Georgia, have opted to also be nonprofits. So they're standing organizations as well as a council that's appointed by the governor. The SILC primary responsibility is to develop, initiate, and oversee the state plan for independent living. However, the SILs are strongly involved with the development of that plan. So if you can kind of picture the SILC as like this pond, and all the SILs are like this stream that's flowing into this pond of information, the SILC is gathering it up. They're creating a statewide, unity piece, representation of what the whole state of Georgia centers are looking to do for independent living. And then they monitor and manage the plan through the information that then we provided them on our monthly reports to let them know about updates. So the SILC is not really managing us, but they are monitoring the progress of meeting the goals of that plan and reporting that, on an annual basis to the federal cognizant agency, which right now is CIL still. So in that process, though, because the SILC is also there to help build the resource capacity for the centers, the SILC should be, and in Georgia, I believe it does, be constantly feeding back resources, information, sources, and opportunities for us as a group, which we come together as our network meeting, to discuss, best practices, what's happening, challenges, barriers, obstacles, funding options, and opportunities, and how we might develop an approach to go after that as a group. So each of us operate independently, but together, with the silk kind of being our meeting point, our 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 pond. That's an example I used.
No, that was a great explanation, and I really like that metaphor of the streams flowing into the pond. That gives a nice visual that helps helps me even wrap my mind around this, even though I've been engaging with this material for a while now.
Yeah. Sometimes it becomes challenging on that part, as I mentioned in the beginning, where people, even entities, believe that silk is over us, because
Right.
when we're all these individual agencies, and I do understand, like, from our funders' perspective, especially like our state funding, or whether it's for nursing home transition or for vocational service or what have you, the common thought is that, and it's probably is easier to go right to the silk, to discuss, without really understanding, though, that each of us have those individual contracts, individual relationships, individual boards that we report to. So it can get a little bit rocky, because, like I said, it's an easy contact just to pick up the phone and maybe call Shelly, thinking that she's over us, and she's not over us. She's just there to help, help in mediation of the process and things. So, but
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, because it makes sense why that would be an easy misperception to fall into, considering how a lot of organizations are set up more hierarchical like this, but this seems a much better setup. It's just different, I think, than what people would expect. So I could see how that would be a little bit difficult to communicate, and for people to kind of understand. And but I think you did a great job clarifying it. And I guess I would ask you if you could kind of reflect, if possible, on how the silk has evolved over the years in your involvement with it.
um so obviously the silk, the growth and the evolution has occurred with the expansion of the whole network. So this goes back to, while they're not over us, though, they're still a big part of what we try to do in Georgia. Because even though, as I said, we're all separate, it benefits all of us if we have a strong network and a strong silk. So, the evolve part is kind of a challenge, because from the time I came in, I always saw the silk very strong. And as I said, lots of good, solid advocates participating on that council, lots of collaboration and education occurring. And I think maybe less about the evolution, but maybe more about the applause and, praise for it has been able to have that continuity, even with the change in leadership, to still be able to maintain a strong council, to still be able to draw, on relationships with our government, including our legislators and those that we, discuss independent living with, and the benefit of funding those sources. And so, whereas some organizations have, dropped back, and some silks have, fallen to great disagreement with them, that there's not been a unified goal that's continued. And in Georgia, I can say that from the time I started, I'm pretty confident to say that there has been a unified goal to build up the network of independent living in order for the constituents of Georgia, the residents of Georgia with disabilities, to be able to have better quality of life, to be included, engaged, and part of the community. Now, do we have still some of the same exact barriers that we had 26 years ago? Absolutely. We're still talking about transportation. We're still talking about housing. We're still talking about healthcare and employment. But I think that we've made strides along with the time, along with the silk, kind of helping, because it is in Atlanta, it is at the center of a lot of those conversations. So it helping to move us forward. So less about the involvement and more probably about the consistency and the continuity of maintaining a unified vision.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's a great answer. And I guess I want to close here with asking you if you're willing to reflect on, the current situation with the federal budget cuts. I just wrote an article about this specifically in Athens for their local alt weekly. I talked to Garrick Scott quite a bit about this. And if you could kind of just reflect on the state, in your particular case, but then also of SILs nationwide and what we're potentially facing here, or what we are facing, and the uncertainty and all that with federal budget cuts.
Yeah, I think so. For us, one of the things has been so many things happening so quickly. The the unexpected, there had been so much progress, and just starting to see on a national basis, the inclusion, more inclusive visuals of people with disabilities, whether it's in screen or out in the community and jobs. And with some of these funding cuts that support foundational things that help people get to that place, it's concerning. And, I'm a person, I'm going to be 60 this year. And I've kind of, as a person with disability, I've kind of built, my plan for security and the understanding of like what resources are going to be available. And now the potential of them not being there, it's scary, it's frightening. And just trying to plan, in our organization, we try to look ahead, plan, prepare for, have a solid base, but I'm looking ahead and I'm not convinced of what's going to be available to continue what we've built on. And some of it is happening so quick. Like, as an example, last Friday, we got notification at 8:00 at night that the AmeriCorps program was just canceled. That was 3 of our folks. And that left us like, okay, it was immediate. What do we do on Monday? I wasn't prepared for that. It's like these shocking life circumstances, like, we live life with unexpected things that occur, but this is like stability of things that we count on, that if I don't have Medicaid in place, how do I talk to people about transition out of nursing homes, and how do I talk about housing? We can't operate in a silo, I guess is what I'm trying to say, as Centers for Independent Living. All these other programs are part of the support pieces that we connect people to in order for them to achieve their goal of self-sufficiency and community living and engagement. So the resources in those support systems are vital to help people not be fully dependent on systems, because you kind of braid them, and eventually a lot of persons become more self-sufficient and they're not as dependent upon that, which allows for the next person to move into it. And it's all in question, and not even a full understanding of what may be there or not there. So
Yeah.
It's just scary.
Of course, yeah. I mean, there's the physical reality of these resources, but then there's the mental component of just anyone living with that uncertainty. Garrick described it as mental anguish,
Yes. I spend most days just tired mentally. I'm a problem solver, and I'm always trying to think 3 steps ahead to this problem that I'm expecting. I know it's probably going to come if I'm working with an individual or an agency. Okay, so I kind of know the problem. I know kind of down the road what some of the other barriers are going to be that are going to come up in the process of achieving the goal, because of experience, familiarity. And I also typically know what the likely solutions to those are. right now, I can't get past the current day to think 3 steps ahead because I don't know if that solution is still going to be the option to go to. So every day, I almost feel like, it's starting over. And, like I said, when that program came to end on Friday, I would have never expected that on Monday I was going to have 3 people that didn't, have an assignment to come to. So
That's awful. I didn't know. I mean, I knew that those sorts of things were looming, but this is the first I've heard about the AmeriCorps program. Yeah, it's just terrible to hear
which
that.
for me, it was a good example too, because nothing up to this point had been a strong direct impact. We had gotten some information earlier in January to pause on some services while they evaluated whether or not they were going to be able to be reimbursed for it. But it didn't really hinder us doing our day-to-day. And in honesty, where Walton Options is right now is we're just committed to keep doing what we've been doing until we're told to do otherwise.
Right.
And all of a sudden on Friday was the first experience we had where we were told to do otherwise. And, you'd heard different stories from other workers, employees from different places having that experience of that Friday notice. And now all of a sudden it's like it's right there in your yard, right? And you're realizing the reality of what news could come on another day.
Yeah.
And you need to you have to prepare to make those adjustments.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I've taken up the time that I asked of, but I'll ask real quick. Is there anything you want to add to this that a takeaway that you didn't get to say earlier?
I have always been very proud of the relationship amongst the centers and the SILC overall in Georgia. Now, we're family, so like any family, you might have some small little spats. But when I've looked at other states and seen the division and huge arguments or things like that have happened that have not been unified for the focus of the independent living movement, it makes me sad. So I've always been very happy that the center directors work so collaboratively together and sharing ideas, sharing funding, sharing resources, supporting everyone, including the SILC, because again, that's kind of our meeting point together as a whole, from emergency planning, emergency disaster support to group collaboration on a grant or whatever it might be, the drive for the additional counties to be funded, the state plans, coming up with similar goals, and just the wealth of history that we have with some of the advocates that have helped to lead that and grow it for Georgians has been a great source of pride in my heart.
Well, I think that's a great spot to end on. Thank you so much again, Tiffany, for your time. And this is really valuable kind of archival information about the history of this organization. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Accessibility Now, a podcast produced by the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. I'm Matt Shedd, reminding you that a Georgia that includes everyone is better for all of us.